There are very few things in life that bisexuals love as much as vampires. Don't believe me? Ask a bisexual. I'm not joking. Pause the video right now and go and message your bisexual friends. And I'm gonna take the fangs off. And if you're bisexual, ask yourself what feelings those fanged, blood-sucking and blouse-wearing beings awaken in you. If you don't have any bisexual friends and are not bisexual yourself, here's my cat named after Count Dracula. He even has a personally tailored little vampire cloak. Okay, now that we have established that bisexuals yearn for the undead, it's only reasonable to pose a question as to why that is. And because I can never just give you a short answer, we will examine the history of vampires in media as well as examples representative of different eras to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that vampires are inherently bi-coded. I wasn't joking when I said you won't be getting a short answer. Vampirologists argue that the earliest folk stories about vampire-like creatures could be traced back as far as 4,000 years BC. The bloodsuckers have been present in folklore for forever. Mesopotamia, ancient Greece, the Celts, all of them had stories that helped explain death and disaster. Fun fact, by the way, most of the ancient vampire-like creatures were depicted as predatory demonic women, because I guess there's nothing scarier than a bad bitch. But the lore that arguably had the most influence on the creation of the vampire archetype originates from Eastern Europe, namely Romania, Slavic regions, and neighboring countries. Now, these beliefs mostly came from the general lack of education and knowledge regarding death and how decomposition affects the body. For instance, one of the supposed signs of vampirism, warmth of an already dead and buried body, is nothing more than a result of decomposition, which produces heat. The real-life vampire hunts of Eastern Europe are a truly fascinating topic that we sadly will not be getting into, but I do know a video that you should watch if this interests you. Reading up on this was mad funny considering that I'm Slavic, so probably at least one of my ancestors was just running around stabbing random dead people with a wooden stake. Eastern Europeans were historically pagan, and when the Christian Church tried to establish its power over the region, circa 11th century, it needed a PR move of sorts. The first vampire hunter manual, the Malleus Maleficarum, claimed that Christian symbols could repel and even kill vampires. So yeah, the iconic piece of vampire lore comes from the Christian Church's greed for power, but what's new? The garlic part, by the way, comes from the fact that Eastern Europeans A. love garlic more than life, and B. believe it can cure literally anything and everything. Whenever there would be a flu outbreak at my kindergarten, my mother made me wear the plastic part of a Kinder egg stuffed with garlic, because it supposedly repels both airborne diseases and spawns of Satan. What does that have to do with bisexuality, though? A lot, actually, but first of all, I just wanted to tell you the fun fact about 5-year-olds smelling like garlic. We will get to bi people, trust me. In the 14th century, thanks to the bubonic plague, the vampire myth got something of a renaissance, as many believed that the so-called Black Death was the work of the undead. After that calmed down, the panic didn't fully stop, and vicious weirdos with a taste for torture, such as Elizabeth Bathory, Gilles de Rais, and Vlad Tepes, would be claimed vampires. So historically, the fanged creatures would be considered spawns of evil, so far removed from anything human that only the supernatural could explain away their actions. How did those spooky, scary, and overall unpleasant creatures turn into the hedonistic beauties that people yearn for? Well, you can thank Lord Byron for that.
Who is this irresistible creature who has an insatiable love for the dead?
Shout out to Nicole Raffi, by the way. So, Lord Byron, the epitome of chaos and bisexuality, was certainly a character himself. Throughout the course of his life, he supposedly identified as a vampire, a pirate, a fallen angel, and even the devil himself, and had an open fascination with the occult. R.I.P. Lord Byron, you would have fucking loved neo-pronouns. He had, or at least pursued, affairs with anyone and everyone who had a pulse, which oftentimes led to drama. And one particular instance of such drama actually shaped the entire archetype of the romantic vampire that we now know and love. As Bradford points out in a blog post about vampires and bisexuality, it is difficult to classify Lord Byron's sexuality since modern sexual identities were not yet developed. The word bisexual was not used until 1892 in the Psychopathia Sexualis, a book about sexual pathologies. So I'm very obviously using the term bisexual loosely here, based on Byron's own admissions and a huge number of well-documented homo and heterosexual affairs. But like, what is he gonna do? Come back from the dead and tell me I'm wrong? For the longest time, Byron scholars ignored heaps of evidence in favor of Byron's bisexuality, but now it is pretty much a universally accepted fact. Update. While I was scripting and recording this video, Casroll released a piece on Lord Byron, and I love their channel, so if you want more info on this absolute gem of a life, definitely check that video out. So, let's get back to business. The year is 1816, and a bunch of authors get together on a villa. Let's meet the cast. First is, of course, Lord Byron himself. Already a well-known scandalous poet in exile, surrounded by rumors of incest, dysfunctional marriage, endless affairs, and debts higher than Mount Everest, he left England forever and, after some years of travel, ended up in Geneva for the summer.
Welkom in Europa, jongen!
Joining him on the main stage of drama is John William Polidori, a poet, a medical doctor, and Byron's personal physician at the time of travel, as his usual doctors weren't available en route. Now, he was invited to the function because he was supposed to look after Byron's health, which was damaged by alcoholism and an eating disorder. Now, fun fact, both of them were strongly advised against the arrangement, and both of them got a fair share of told you so's after this whole thing blew up in their faces. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself, and I don't wanna spoil too much. Polidori's obsession with Byron was, on one hand, warranted. I mean, that was literally his job. But on the other hand, it was a little scary as it bordered on the line between love and hate. The third and fourth important person at the party are the Shelleys, aka Mary Godwin, who would go on to become Mary Shelley, you all know because she wrote the absolute classic that is Frankenstein, and Percy Shelley, who I frankly do not really care about. So we already know how Polidori entered Byron's life, but what about this lovely couple? Lord Byron actually had an affair with Claire Clairmont, who is a stepsister of Mary Shelley, which ended up in her giving birth to a daughter named Allegra. Other than that, the Shelleys were, in general, fans of Byron's art and the chaos that ensued everywhere Byron went. But we are not done yet. There is a little someone who was also very important to this whole drama, but was not present at the scene of the crime. It's Lady Caroline Lamb, who was, not surprisingly, an author herself. The aristocrat met Byron in 1812, and the rest was pure drama, with their affair unfolding in the open and coming to a halt at the end of summer. Now, we know that very few of Byron's affairs ended without some kind of grand scandal, and the relationship with Lady Caroline Lamb was definitely one of the messier ones. In 1816, 4 years after their breakup, and the year of the drama that we're about to delve into, Lady Caroline Lamb published her first ever novel, which was titled Glenarvon. Now, the main character of Glenarvon is a very obvious and also a very unflattering depiction of her ex-lover, Lord Byron. And his full name is Clarence de Ruthven, by the way. Remember this for later, I promise this will be important. Lord Byron, you gotta stop. Your bisexuality too chaotic. Your scandals too entertaining. Your affairs too messy. Okay, back to Lake Geneva. It's June of 1816, and Byron, Polidori, the Shelleys, and Claire all hang out at Villa Diodati. Well, actually, Byron rented the villa and stayed there with Polidori, and the Shelleys and Claire stayed in a house nearby. The summer is kind of shit. It's so shit, in fact, that 1816 will come to be known as the year without a summer. So, you know, there wasn't really a lot of barbecue and brunches happening. Now, none of the sources that I used could specify how and why they all began reading Phantasmagoria, which is a collection of short German stories out loud, but all sources point to the fact that it was Byron who suggested that everyone at the villa, well, everyone except for Claire, okay, shade, should write their own ghost story and have a little contest. Like, see who does it best. Now, there's no proof that those stories were written to be published, so all of the characters at the villa had a little fun with them. And by having fun, I mean Mary Shelley wrote the story that later became Frankenstein, and Polidori wrote a story about how Byron was the spawn of Satan. The book, which was later published under the name The Vampire, was supposedly actually plagiarized from Byron's contribution to this whole little contest thing. Because Byron started working on a story of a traveler that came to Greece and was there revealed to be a vampire, but never finished it and ultimately gave up. So The Vampire, the first modern bloodsucker fiction to be published, followed the story of someone by the name of Lord Ruthven, a vampire who was extremely manipulative, self-absorbed, and trying to seduce everyone he met. You don't even need to get deep into Byron lore to realize that Lord Ruthven was in fact Polidori's take on his patient, friend, and object of desires. Fun fact, do you remember the name of the main character of Caroline Lamb's stab at Byron? If you don't, it was Clarence de Ruthven. Like, kudos for that, mama, for referencing a fellow ex of Byron. And The Vampire actually has a character based on Lady Caroline Lamb. Her name is Lady Mercer. The plot follows Lord Ruthven, the vampire in question, and Aubrey, his young and naive companion, who is at first fascinated with Lord Ruthven, but ultimately ends up discovering that the man is not only wicked and conniving, but also the undead. Now that we're familiar with the drama, let's examine the importance of The Vampire and its influence on practically all vampire fiction. The novel was published in 1819, 3 years after the whole mess at Villa Diodati unfolded. To make matters worse, when it was first published, The Vampire was mistakenly attributed to Lord Byron himself. Both Polidori and Byron had to send publishers and translators numerous letters detailing who actually wrote it, which was a whole mess in and of itself. The novel became huge, in part due to the copyright drama, in part due to people thinking it was a work of Byron, and in part due to the fact that Polidori brought the vampire topic back into the public consciousness and also gave it an interesting twist. The vampires, who, as you may remember from like 10 minutes ago, were depicted as nasty creatures and savage beasts in the folklore, got a new edge. Lord Ruthven, for once, was a refined aristocrat, seductive and fascinating. The vampire, therefore, becomes a romantic and tragic figure, one that is infinitely interesting than just pure evil with no motivation. Fun fact, by the way, this novel is where the vampire lore gets the bit about vampires preferring nighttime from. As pointed out by Corvus Nocturnum, the Italian doctor, who attempted many times to become more than friends with the other man, went back and forth expressing his writings from love to hate. This was no doubt the influence for future plot aspects of the early ambiguous sexual leanings that vampire have since exuded, in both males and females alike, from then till now. While Lord Ruthven is not overtly bisexual, he is shockingly sexual in general, and is also based on Byron, who, as we have established, was not picky when it came to the gender of his lovers. Therefore, whether intentionally or not, Polidori's character was quite queer, even if not in the most obvious of ways. When answering the questions about whether all vampires are inherently bi, one of the Reddit users pointed out that all vampires are inherently Byronesque and therefore inherently bisexual. And they didn't lie. Byron's messy love life would give us the character that would define vampire media for centuries to come. Polidori's love-hate relationship with his employer and friend ultimately manifested in a novel that unexpectedly blew up, and both reminded the public of the fanged and evil creatures and changed the way those fanged and evil creatures were depicted and what they represented. The Vampire established the charismatic and sophisticated archetype and influenced all vampire media, including the absolute classic that is Bram Stoker's Dracula. Fictional vampires often express a secret agenda of their author or creator, from Polidori's Lord Ruthven as a demonization of his former friend Lord Byron, to Stoker's Count Dracula as a prudish nature, demonizing sexuality during the scandals in those who balked the repression of Victorian sexuality. Where do I even start with this? I mean, there's so much to unpack about Bram Stoker's Dracula and its influence on vampire media we consume nowadays. Let's try to unfold all of this from the very beginning, aka the 1897 novel. Bram Stoker's take on the undead was rather influenced by Victorian anxieties, those of the changing world order and the other. Dracula tells the story of, you guessed it, Count Dracula, a Transylvanian nobleman who buys a bunch of real estate in London and travels there with the supposed purpose of creating an army of vampires just like him and ruling the new world. His plans are, however, interrupted by a group of Englishmen that consists of Jonathan Harker and his fiancée Mina, Professor Van Helsing, Dr. Seward, Quincy Morris, and Arthur Holmwood. For starters, Mina Harker, one of the main characters, can be read as a new woman, with her playing an active role in the events and being as much of a participant as her male counterparts. The new woman, a term coined by Victorian feminists, was an idea and a movement advocating for women's rights and gender equality. As Boyne points out, if the new woman was autonomous, with personal, social, and economic control over her own life, she was also something to be feared. Now, whether Mina is actually a new woman or not has been an open debate for a while now, practically ever since the book came out. Blažević, for one, argues that Mina is much more of a new woman at the very beginning of the story, with some of her agency being stripped away during the course of the novel. Within this reading, Mina is called an acceptable and proper new woman because she's an educated and competent worker, but also a submissive wifely or motherly figure whose character traits correspond to conservative Victorian notions of female propriety. But it's undeniable that at the turn of the century, characters like Mina mostly appeared in fiction through authors trying to make sense of the rapidly changing gender roles and the ever-growing number of middle-class women demanding to have the same rights and treatments as men. As some researchers put it, Bram Stoker's Dracula embodies a collective dream reflecting Victorian sex roles and repression. Other female characters, like the three female vampires preying on Jonathan at Dracula's castle, or Lucy, Mina's best friend, seem to show the other side of the new woman. Lucy is defying the norms of Victorian society in a more open way. For instance, she struggles with having to reject 2 out of 3 men who propose to her. I mean, she literally says, why can't they let a girl marry 3 men, or as many as want her, and save all this trouble? But this is heresy, and I must not say it. Through being turned into a vampire, Lucy's transformation into the unacceptable new woman is finalized. The same take on the new woman can be seen in the scene where 3 female vampires come very close to biting Jonathan. The whole scene is very sexually charged. Well, it is as sexually charged as the Victorian norms and the circumstances of Bram Stoker's life allowed it to be, but the characters do at the end of the day represent the indulgence-seeking femme fatales. A character that is obviously more relevant to our discussion is Count Dracula himself. The Count represents perceived monstrosity in numerous ways. For one, he is the racialized other. Dracula is a foreigner that travels to England with the goal to take over and create an army of creatures that are exactly like him. As pointed out by Scal, the great Gothic character then taken shape in Stoker's mind has, in recent years, been criticized as an anti-Semitic stereotype, and perhaps deservedly. The simple idea of a hook-nosed foreigner who steals babies for their blood, of course, comes straight out of the time-dishonored playbook of the blood libel, not to mention the recoiling from Christian symbols. Stoker's attitudes towards Jewish people were sadly nothing out of the ordinary in Victorian England, where fear and distrust towards anyone perceived as a foreigner was the norm. This, however, does not negate the fact that, whether written so intentionally or not, Dracula is the other that is described in a way that resembles Jewish people, namely ones from Eastern Europe. And in the novel, his otherness is threatening towards the Englishmen who are portrayed as the good guys. They are literally saving the world from the other. That's like the plot of Dracula. As Lomo puts it cannot be ignored that the Victorian Gothic sent very clear messages about who was to be feared, who was a threat to the English way of life. Another aspect of the Count's character is that he's the religious other. For instance, Mina, after being bitten by him, refers to herself as unclean, and after Van Helsing touches a piece of the sacred wafer to her forehead, it burns into his skin as though it had been a piece of white-hot metal. Dracula also covers at the side of Christian religious symbols, which further ties vampires into being spawns of Satan and religious others. I mean, this is completely unsurprising considering everything you're about to learn about Bram Stoker's life and the circumstances under which the novel was written, but still, this is frankly
sloppy, lazy.
The Count is also represented as the sexual other. According to Tracy, if the 18th century Gothic novel is about psychological terror, the vampire novel is about physical, and specifically sexual fear. The shift from ghosts to vampires indicates a reordering of the categories of fear. A ghost can only frighten or warn. It is bodiless and therefore incapable of causing physical harm. But the vampire has a body, and therefore represents at once a physical, a supernatural, spiritual, and a sexual menace. Dracula is obsessed with Jonathan, the protagonist, to the point of where he claims the man. When the three female vampires try to get a piece of that sweet Englishman Jonathan, Dracula gets enraged and says the following: "How dare you touch him, any of you? How dare you cast eyes on him when I had forbidden it? Back, I tell you all. This man belongs to me. Beware how you meddle with him, or you'll have to do with me." We also see Dracula prey on Lucy, Mina, and Jonathan. As Lomo puts it, Dracula emerges as a source of contradiction, not just as the vampiric other, but also the side of polymorphous desire for Jonathan. He certainly is bi-homicidal. Now, how does the killing tie into sexuality? Well, that is literally established within the novel. Blood and its exchange is seen as inherently sexual. Lucy, after being bitten by Dracula, needs blood transfusions, and Arthur, her fiancé, says that him donating blood to her made her truly his bride. The act of a vampire biting someone is also quite easily read as sexual. Bradford writes, "Even if drinking blood is not viewed as a metaphor for sex, it is an intimate act in that it usually involves drinking directly from the neck, which is often viewed as a central location for kissing in Western societies. This act is usually done privately and at night, again, if not blatantly sexual, at least following social conventions regarding sex." In addition to Dracula's obsession with Jonathan and his pursuit of Mina and Lucy, there's one more aspect to his otherness. Dracula, despite being a man, can give birth, which is kind of giving T-boy swag. Like, okay, I see you, king. Through killing his victims, he makes them into vampires, thus making them his children. This makes him inherently feminine, thus once again tying into the topic of changing gender roles and fear of sexual others which troubled Victorian society. But what if those motifs manifested in Bram Stoker's work subconsciously? Poor little Victorian man didn't know gay people would be reading it like that centuries later. Didn't know my ass. Tracy actually examines this claim and points to the fact that Bram Stoker was a man of the world moving in London literally and theatrical circles at a time when prostitution was highly visible. The sexual and personal rights and needs of women were a matter of debate. Stoker also worked for Henry Irving, a man that he was obsessed with to the point where his friends called it the strongest love that man may feel for man. He also wrote intimate letters that could be interpreted as romantic to said friends and kept in very close contact with male authors and colleagues, while references to his actual wife remain few and far between. He actually exhibited many behaviors that could be considered sus. Let me present you two distinct cases. Number one is Walt Whitman, an American poet that was constantly stirring up controversy with his art. What really disturbed certain readers from 1855 onward was his frank discussion of sex, and not just ordinary male-female sex, but seemingly endless references to affectionate male-male camaraderie and manly love, including men kissing and embracing, and perhaps even more, given all the blunt talk about man balls and man root along the way. Today, Walt Whitman is considered a gay icon, whereas he himself has never acknowledged his affairs and relationship with men. I mean, understandably so, as it was considered a moral deviation that would likely get you on trial. Young Bram Stoker was, for a lack of a better term, a huge fanboy of Walt Whitman. Count Dracula, as some suppose, reflects Whitman's sexually charged and seductive nature. Now connect that little fact with Dracula's obsession with Jonathan, basically Stoker's self-insert. Stoker and Whitman have actually exchanged letters that are described as passionate, youthful correspondence, where the former confesses to only being able to be truly open with Whitman, but not with the larger society. Number 2 is Oscar Wilde. Now, Wilde and Stoker have been friends since their student days, and the whole vampires don't show up in mirrors thing was actually inspired by the portrait of Dorian Gray. That's how much of an influence Wilde had on Stoker. After the scandalous trials of Wilde, which included the charges of homosexual relations took place, Bram Stoker suddenly had a change of heart and disregarded the 20 years of friendship, even though the matters discussed at the trial were nothing new or secret to anyone who was acquainted with the author. The trials actually played a big role in facilitating the context in which Dracula was written. The man that was previously enamored with Walt Whitman's sexually charged poems was now suddenly condemning all authors that dared to include any mention of sex in their work. As one of Stoker's biographies points out, it is no coincidence that Wilde was persecuted as a sexual threat to Victorian London at the same cultural moment Stoker created the greatest sex monster of all time. Well, Stoker's grandnephew also speculated that his marriage was completely sexless and that Stoker died of syphilis that he contracted from a sex worker, and that was the reason for his sudden change of heart. But that's beside the point, that's just some hot goss. Am I making any accusations regarding Stoker's sexuality? No, I'm not, and frankly, I could not care less who Stoker was stroking it to, but understanding the conflicted nature of his life and his close ties to and later condemnation of the artists who were notorious for their bi and homosexual relations is extremely important to grasping the more subtler points of Dracula. You know who is making the accusation though? Stoker's biographers and his grandnephew. In addition to all of this, we can see some subtler themes turn more overt to suit the spirit and the norms of time in different movie adaptations of Dracula. Take, for example, the one with Bela Lugosi released in 1931. It is quite tame even when compared to the book. We don't really see the 3 female vampires be fair and voluptuous as described in Jonathan's diary, nor do we see that longing and deadly fear he feels for them. All of the biting happens off-screen, and Dracula's obsession with Jonathan is toned down even when compared to the book, which isn't surprising seeing as the predecessor of the Hays Code was already in action. In 1927, 4 years before the movie's release, the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors Association of America created a resolution of don'ts and be carefuls. The don'ts included any inference of sex perversion, and the be carefuls included brutality and possible gruesomeness, as well as excessive or lustful kissing, particularly when one character or the other is a villain. So yeah, no homoerotic obsessions and no hot vampire women for us guys. The 1992 movie, on the other hand, goes all out with the sex and the lust, partly to accommodate for the moved goalposts of what was considered scandalous, and partly because the changes made are a logical continuation of what the original work implies. Like, Dracula biting Lucy is turned into a sex scene, and we do get to see the hot vampire women being overtly sexual and seductive towards Jonathan. Implied romance between Dracula and Minna is amplified, and I do think that this movie adaptation would kill a certain Victorian author if syphilis didn't kill him first. I couldn't come up with a segue better than Loma has already done, so I'm just gonna quote their thesis. If Dracula, in all his iterations, flirts with bisexuality and homoeroticism, then the vampires of the 1980s take bisexuality by the hand and dance. While Polydorus the Vampire and Bram Stoker's Dracula were indisputably important to shaping the image of bloodsuckers in pop culture, Anne Rice and her Vampire Chronicles brought in something that is now crucial to vampire media. She made them sympathetic and truly romantic. Now, in this chapter, I'm going to focus on Interview with the Vampire, the first book of Vampire Chronicles, and its 1994 movie adaptation. Mostly because if I didn't, the video would be moving into Quentin Review's length territory, and neither I nor my laptop are strong enough to get through something like that. So Louis, the protagonist of Interview with the Vampire, is not like the other vampires, but not in a pick-me way. He is extremely self-aware and self-reflective, retaining his humanity and ability to be sympathetic towards others. Interview with the Vampire is built around Louis' internal conflict, that of him trying to make sense of his identity and find a place where he truly belongs. As pointed out by Stein in her book about Byronic characters in media, a romantic desires what is unattainable. Should that desire become attained, it becomes, by definition, no longer desirable. The situation provides the romantic with an infinite capacity for self-pity, lamenting both the unattainability of his or her desires and the undesirability of his or her goals once attained. Louis, in true Byronic fashion, can never catch a fucking break. As he himself admits, "I'm not the spirit of any age. I'm at odds with everything and always have been. I have never belonged anywhere with anyone at any time." His vampire identity brings him mental turmoil. From having to feed on others to not feeling at home in any vampire community he encounters, Louis is a tragic hero. Lestat can also be named a Byronic hero, but more so around Polydorus territory. He is a social, aristocratic vampire who attacks the poor quickly and violently without the protracted seduction saved for their upper-class women. He fits the previously popular mold of evil aristocratic vampire way better than Louis does, where Lestat accepts something like killing people as merely part of vampire nature. Louis tries to find ways of retaining his humanity, or at least the morals that came with it. Lestat, however, is not completely free from suffering himself. While he isn't as self-aware as his counterpart, he still falls into the pattern of a tragic Byronic romantic. Take, for instance, his dream of creating a family with Louis and Claudia and how they both come to hate him. Lestat's fate is tragic because he can never be someone deserving of what he yearns for the most. R.I.P. Lestat, you would have loved emo slam poetry. The appeal of vampires being vulnerable and at times a little pathetic is perfectly described by Stein. We envy his power and autonomy, his ability simply to do what he wants without fear or authority, but we are drawn to his humanity. If such a powerful being suffers from feelings of isolation and confusion and makes terrible errors in his dealings with others, then our own feelings and errors are more acceptable, particularly when we see them glamorized and romanticized in the form of vampire or other similarly powerful entities. The vampires in Anne Rice's fiction are still portrayed as the other, but not necessarily the racialized other threatening to the normal way of life. The flip of the point of view allows us to see the story from the perspective of said other and dive into their emotional wreck of a life. And while Dracula's accent and his peculiar way of speaking is crucial to him being perceived as the evil foreigner, Louis' French accent is portrayed as an interesting part of his lore, but nothing to be feared or hated. The perspective flip evokes sympathy in the reader and humanizes the fanged monsters that were previously depicted as the epitome of all things evil. We see vampires go through very human things like falling in love, attempts at making sense of your own identity, and feelings of being ostracized and misunderstood. In addition, Anne Rice's vampires are not depicted as the religious other, unlike Dracula. Louis shares that he's actually fond of the sight of crucifixes, and we see him recount his religious journey and renegotiate faith after being converted to a vampire. He does not feel any discomfort at the sight of churches or any other religious attributes, but his relationship with God is definitely complicated. He literally says, "Do you see what I am? Why, if God exists, does he suffer me to exist?" when trying to confess his sins to a priest. Louis is a prime example of the new type of other in vampire fiction. He is neither here nor there. He does not feel like he belongs with the old-timey vicious vampires. He is rather doomed than evil. But then he also cannot lead a traditional human life due to his very nature. Does that ring a bell, bisexuals? Sure, this is sad and all, all, but how does this new breed of vampires tie into the whole bisexual thing we're talking about here? I promise you it does, but first you gotta listen to 2 fun facts before we proceed. Fun fact number 1. Interview with a Vampire further solidified the link between vampires and wearing all black. At the very beginning, the interviewer mentions that Louis is wearing a tailored black coat, and later in the book, Louis mentions that Lestat thought the best color at all times for vampires was black, possibly the only aesthetic principle he steadfastly maintained. Fun fact number 2, the book also establishes a connection between vampirism and revenge. Revenge drives Louis and other vampires places I wouldn't even personally go to with a gun. He literally burns hundreds of vampires in Europe as a way to take revenge on them for killing Claudia. And when it comes to Lestat, revenge isn't even a motif. Louis literally spells it out. I rather think that he ushered Claudia into vampirism for revenge. Revenge, not only on you but on the world, suggested the boy. Yes, as I said, Lestat's motifs for everything revolved around revenge. Interview with the Vampire starts off quite queer. The interviewer meets Louis at a bar and then proceeds to follow him to Divisadero Street, which is right on the edge of the gay district in San Francisco, the city itself being known as not particularly straight. In his 1997 book about homosexuality and horror, Harry Benshoff calls The Vampire Chronicles probably the most important development in recent queer horror. He points to the fact that the series makes the connection between vampirism and queerness quite explicit. For starters, there's the love-hate story between Louis and Lestat, as well as the 2 vampires becoming fathers to Claudia. And Rice makes the connection between vampires draining blood and sex very obvious. I mean, it's literally stated in the book. Louis tells the boy that, for vampires, physical love culminates and is satisfied in one thing: the kill. Not to mention the numerous descriptions of how witnessing vampires kill or killing someone himself gets Louis all hot and bothered. Rice has explicitly stated that vampires in her universe cannot have sex, and biting therefore replaces it. Once again, in the book, Louis compares it to the pleasure of passion. Another layer of explicitness comes from the fact that Louis and Lestat share a coffin on Louis' first night as a vampire. The overt sexuality of it all does not mean, however, that feelings of genuine love are completely foreign to the fanged bloodsuckers. The main character talks about his love for both Babette, a mortal woman, and Armand, a fellow vampire he meets in Europe. He also differentiates between different types of love he feels for those he considers equal and for Claudia, whom he considers his child. Out of the various types of love the book explores, we should very obviously focus on the vampiric lust for blood. As Louis states, Lestat killed humans all the time, sometimes 2 or 3 a night, sometimes more. A fresh young girl, that was his favorite food for the first of the evening. But the triumphant kill for Lestat was a young man. A young man around your age would have appealed to him in particular. Lestat, therefore, is kind of the thought daughter of the series. He's the more openly evil and Byron-esque character, and therefore his bisexuality, or bisexual promiscuity, is more visible. Louis, on the contrary, is kind of the desperate gay son in this whole debacle. He embodies not only the love and lust that transgresses gender, but also the fluidity of the bisexual identity. As pointed out by Ossap, vampires are also perfect examples for how the Kinsey scale works. Louis, for instance, is most likely heterosexual and therefore in the lower digits on the scale during his mortal life. However, after he meets Lestat and is turned into a vampire, he moves further up the scale towards homosexuality. He climbs even higher on the scale after he has fallen in love with Armand. While it would be completely valid to advocate for an explicitly gay reading on some of the characters, Anne Rice's interviews still point us to something more ambiguous and middle of the spectrum. As she herself said, "I know my imagination definitely tends to be in a realm where people transcend gender." Let me make one thing clear. In 1976, when this book was first released, the queerness of monsters was nothing new, especially to those in the community. But the worldwide success of The Vampire Chronicles has definitely influenced the mainstream narratives and made them lean towards a more queer and overall sexual mood. Well, until Mormons ruined it all, but there's gonna be a whole chapter dedicated to that. And even with the widespread success of Anne Rice's books, it still took Hollywood almost 20 years to release a movie adaptation of Interview with the Vampire. According to Rice, Hollywood was for years afraid to make a movie of Interview because they didn't want to be accused of homosexuality in conjunction with child molesting. In an attempt to make her work more big screen friendly, Rice has tried to implement numerous changes when writing the script. She rewrote the part of Louis, changing his sex to female in order specifically to heterosexualize his or her relationship with Lestat. At the time, Rice felt it was the only way to get the film made. Cher was considered for the part. It is rumored that well-acclaimed actors were very apprehensive and even a little afraid of playing the part of Louis or Lestat, as they felt that homoerotic and homoromantic narratives of the movie would tarnish their reputation and stop them from getting reputable and serious straight roles. When Tom Cruise, of all people, took on the role of Lestat, Anne Rice was initially not happy about some macho dude playing her beloved and devious alter ego, but she ultimately ended up loving his performance. She went on to say that the film fearlessly allowed my tormented vampire outsiders to transcend gender and to speak from their souls about matters of life, death, loneliness, guilt, and pain. And when the movie finally came to light, Anne Rice didn't try to hide behind the "oh, it's all fiction" facade. In a message from Anne Rice, included with the videotape of Interview with the Vampire, she says, "This movie is not just about vampires. It's really about us." And as I have mentioned before, she confirmed that Lestat was, in a way, her self-projection. "He's my devil, my dark lover, my alter ego. Sometimes I think he's my conscience." Every era needs its own kind of vampire, and as Bradford points out, vampires are very much a reflection of the times in which they were imagined. And the Vampire Chronicles, with their gender transgressions, love that transcends gender, and open sexuality, gave the 20th century the push it needed by challenging and unfolding the previous notions pop culture held about fanged bloodsuckers. Anne Rice's work continues to influence our idea of vampires and get new readings and adaptations. Take, for example, the show that was first released in 2022, and considering how long this whole thing is taking, has probably already gotten its second season. What do you remember about the 2000s? I personally remember learning how to type and begging my mother to let me get a scene kid haircut, which she didn't, and that was kind of a blessing because it's been over 15 years and I still don't know how to style my hair. In 2003, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation concluded that, while in the past bisexual characters have proven to be popular in shows and have even been known to boost ratings, there are no bisexual characters on primetime today. The networks have chosen to ignore bisexuality in the plots of their shows. Quite soon, however, there was a lot more bisexual and overall sexually fluid presence in the mainstream. Take, for instance, House and 13, or the Britney and Madonna kiss at the 2003 VMAs. Katy Perry kissed a girl, and Lady Gaga confirmed her bisexuality in numerous interviews. Being bi was the new hot and scandalous thing.
There's a lot of bisexuality. Oh, so it's not even interesting. It's not interesting to be gay.
Tila Tequila of MySpace fame got her own reality TV show, which was kind of like The Bachelor, but for the first time ever, was centered around a bisexual bachelorette. According to The Hollywood Reporter, the show ranked #1 in its time period across all cable in the network's target demographic of people aged 18 to 34. The success of the show got it renewed for a second season and even spawned a spin-off. The Real World, one of the longest-running programs on TV, featured 2 bisexual characters in its 2009 The Real World Washington, D.C. season. Now, we of course need to know that bisexuals were largely fetishized, especially the femme-presenting people, and oftentimes portrayed as spicy, straight, inherently promiscuous, or tricking their partner by leading a double life. Very Bitchy goes into more detail in her video essay about the 2000s bisexual chic, and while there are some things I would have framed or phrased differently, the video still provides a very solid overview of the sentiment the era held toward bisexuals. Jennifer's Body, that came out in 2009, is, at least to me, the culmination of all things 2000s. It has grown people playing teenagers, Panic at the Disco in the soundtrack, low-waisted jeans, and numerous shots that will probably haunt Tumblr till the end of time. The movie follows a story of two best friends, Jennifer and Needy. The former is a very conventionally attractive cheerleader who seems to be very popular among her peers, while the latter is presented as a nerd and outsider of sorts. Jennifer gets sacrificed for fame by a local band that mistakes her for a virgin, and as a result of that turns into a vicious creature that drains boys of their blood to sustain life. Needy then has to figure out what's happening to her best friend and attempt to stop it. Why is this movie even in a video about bisexuals and vampires? Well, because I consider Jennifer to be a vampire. Now it can be argued whether Megan Fox's character is one, and she is more often classified as a succubus, even within the movie, but I advocate for an explicitly vampire reading. Jennifer's character returns to the roots of the vampire genre, making her a true undead. She drinks exclusively male blood, which is framed as more of a revenge thing than something she had no say in.
How can you say that? You're killing people. No, I'm killing boys.
And if you can still remember some of the stuff I said in regards to Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles, her work frames revenge as the key point of motivation for vampires. Jennifer has the classic attributes of a vampire: the paleness, the need for blood, and the sharp, elongated teeth, so I consider her to be a daywalker. In addition, Corvus Nocturnum, a vampirologist who I've been quoting a lot throughout the vid, groups the succubus with other vampire-adjacent folklore myths, which you can disagree with, but it's my channel, so I get the final say when it comes to this video. A lot of people read Jennifer as strictly homosexual, and I have seen claims that Megan Fox played the character as a deeply closeted lesbian, but I couldn't find a solid source to verify that. This movie, however, touches on the idea of bisexuality. I mean, Jennifer literally says she goes both ways.
I am going to eat your soul. Thought you only murdered boys. I go both ways.
And we can see her genuinely be infatuated with both Needy and the lead singer of the band. Her connection with Needy is, of course, deeper. They have literally been friends since childhood, and Needy's obsession with Jennifer is obvious to everyone. To introduce Jennifer, narrator Needy word vomits a stream of compliment upon compliment, only to have her daydream interrupted by a classmate saying she's totally lesbi gay for her attractive, mean, and cooler friend. The tension we see throughout the movie gets resolved with a kiss shared between the main two characters, which comes naturally to Jennifer but makes Needy freak out. As one of the contributors to It Came From the Closet points out, Needy's bisexuality comes in fits and starts, serves her and fails her and confounds her. Jennifer dives teeth first into hers. The movie plays into the way queer identities are oftentimes portrayed as monstrous. Just like Louis in Interview with a Vampire, Jennifer, or at least the way she expresses her sexuality, moves up the Kinsey scale after being turned into a monster. As highlighted by quite a big number of queer people, the movie acted as a gay or bi awakening for them. For a 19-year-old me, seeing the sexual tension, the kiss, and hearing Jennifer declare that she goes both ways while sitting next to the girl I was crushing on, made me realize I needed to start seriously coming to terms with how I feel about women. I wouldn't come out for another 5 years, but I can confidently say that bisexual representation in media helped me feel comfortable coming to terms with my sexuality, and I often wonder where I would be without Jennifer's body. Megan Fox, who played the role of Jennifer, has first confirmed her bisexuality in a 2009 interview with Esquire and reflected on the movie's legacy in 2021. I can't tell you how many girls from 30 down into their teens, or fuck that, my age too, come up to me and are like, I realized I was gay because of you, or I felt comfortable coming out because of you, because of Jennifer's body and the interviews I did about being bisexual before it was cool. Even though Jennifer's Body didn't get its recognition as a queer horror classic right away, mostly because it was largely marketed towards teenage boys, the movie features a lot of things that are strictly 2000s, including its portrayal of bisexuality, so leaving it out would feel absolutely criminal. Another thing about the 2000s that isn't mentioned as often as low-waisted jeans, but is held near and dear by those who lived through it, is the mainstream emo boom. And before I get the, well, actually, the only real emo was the emotional hardcore scene of Washington, D.C. in the 80s comments, I'd like to pull a quote from Andy Greenwald's book as a long and convoluted way of telling people to shut the fuck up. Originally, emo was short for emocore, a strain of hardcore punk that was notable for its obsession with feelings, as opposed to politics, anger, and smashing stuff up. Then it started to be applied to bands that weren't punk, to fashion trends, to sad-eyed kids in the back of the class. It's always been mildly derisive, a term used by haters and critics to dismiss something that's overly weepy, self-indulgent, or unironic. Every generation that loves emo bands simultaneously rejects the term while claiming ownership of it, meaning even if they won't admit that they love emo, they certainly will say how much they hate everything that's been called emo since then. But still, no one knows what it is. The emo boom that we're gonna be focusing on is the one with the Warped Tour, smudged eyeliner, and rubber bracelets as the only item of merch you could afford. God knows I got a fucking box of them somewhere back at home. The so-called big three of the emo scene that this video is gonna mention, namely My Chemical Romance, Fall Out Boy, and Panic at the Disco, have all more or less rejected the label and all play more or less different styles and genres of music. However, the contextual proximity and the friendships between the musicians, as well as fandom, in like a major way, have solidified those connections and made those bands into the emo Holy Trinity, or the Emo Trinity for short. As Sam DuBois points out in his Cheer Up Emo Kid article, notably, emo has been brought into focus in the Western media for its stress on gender bending and identity queering. But what exactly is identity queering about a bunch of dudes with guitars wearing questionable outfits? Well, considering the roots of the genre, it was more or less an outlier within the hardcore and punk scene, which valued predominantly macho and overall masculine attitudes. Like, what do you mean, more than 3 chords? What do you mean you write songs about your personal life and not the political horrors of the current era? As fandom researchers note, emo as a genre is thoroughly romantic, centering the unique feeling self, the artist, outsider, and high emotion.
This is the first single off of our new record, and it's for all the girls out there, because this is what boys do when they're home alone in the dark thinking about you. It's called Sugar, We're Going Down.
DuBois provides an overview of the new masculinity emo supposedly presents. On the surface, of course, the focus on the emotional inner lives of band members, as well as less hyper-masculine expressions of gender within the scene, may seem like a signifier of softening masculinity. However, I strongly advise you against following this line of thought. Even if emo's rendering of gender roles is oftentimes depicted as opposing the traditional jock-type stuff we see in rock, a lot of displays of casual misogyny are still very much present within the scene. First, interpersonal relationships, which act as the cornerstone of a lot of emo music, still maintain the feminine and masculine binary, as well as the division of women into the good girls and the whores.
What a shame the poor groom's bride is a whore.
DuBois calls that the beta male misogyny and points to Sarah Williams, who said that emo captures the changes in cultural attitudes about masculinity and the musical signifiers of emotional weakness, that is, such undesirable qualities like vulnerability, femininity, weakness, while attempting to retain the musical signifiers of aggression that are the bedrock of punk and hardcore musical style. That is nothing new to rock music, of course. Over 30 years ago, Lawrence Grossberg described how women only had one place they truly belonged in the rock world. The bedroom, that is. So emo might have seemed gender bending and queering if you were on the outside looking in, but the new masculinity it presented had less to do with actual dismantling of punks and hardcore's hegemony of toxic masculinity, and more so with being mad at the girl that the lead singer had a one-sided situationship with. To once again quote DuBois, the inherently homosocial composition of the bands aside, the embracing of heteronormative relationships as a cornerstone of the music, the frequent underlying misogyny, the unease with which love compromises individual autonomy, and the way in which males are perceived as the victims of female sexuality, all suggest that emo is merely an aesthetic reworking of gendered power dynamics. This, however, doesn't mean everything wasn't coming up emo. Of course, the new masculinity we see in emo bands neither destroyed the patriarchy nor helped combat misogyny in rock spaces. But it was, after all, an alternative to the traditional toxic masculinity. For example, for me personally, a closeted and confused kid in Russia, emo bands were kind of the first point of contact with the idea that queer people exist and deserve, rights and stuff. I mean, however dumb this may sound, seeing the displays of what would later be dubbed stage gay helped me come to terms with my own queerness. The so-called stage gay is defined as demonstrations of male-on-male affection and eroticism, up to and including full kissing and simulating sex on stage. It's oftentimes brought up in the same breath as queerbaiting, but I do have opinions on it, and so do some researchers. From the perspective of our current, not really roaring 20s, two dudes kissing on stage is nothing new or shocking, really. But doing that in, say, 2002 was something else entirely. Again, considering the overall hyper-masculine attitudes of a vast array of rock subgenres, such behavior could be read as a challenge to the heteronormative society, which, as Gerard Way once stated, was the goal. Whether things that fall into the definition of stage gay can be classified as queerbaiting is a tricky conversation. First, I would have to point out that they don't align in intent. To quote Judith Fathala, strictly speaking, queerbaiting is designed specifically to draw in queer viewers and their money before undermining their investments, both emotional and financial, in favor of the heteronormative majority. When we examine the displays of homoeroticism on stage, we cannot tell what was going through musicians' heads and whether they were calculated enough to know that sometime in the future, friendless queer losers are gonna love their music. More to that, the argument about such performances of perceived queerness not being real gives me the ick, because even though emo is a very cis-het man genre, we cannot make judgments about someone's gender or sexual identity based on the glimpse we get in interviews or performances. And celebrities also don't owe the public details of their private life. Everyone has a different journey in figuring out their identity, and identities can change throughout one's life, so who are we to judge whether something was not real? Lastly, the outcome of the debate depends largely on your personal understanding and definition of queerness. And the queerbaiting point of view, as Fathala rightfully points out, rather limits and constrains the meaning of queerness, which properly denotes sexual fluidity and the dissolution of gendered boundaries rather than a binary opposition to heterosexuality. While the question of whether the bands that achieved mainstream success have profited from stage gay remains unanswered, there is a group of people that definitely benefited from that: the fans. The attitudes demonstrated by band members brought homoeroticism and all other things dubbed gay to the mainstream rock scene, which coincided with the overall 2000s bi-curiosity. Those two events merged in synergy to the point of where being a queer emo kid was kind of the norm and expected. I mean, there's even an incredible 2007 Urban Dictionary entry that describes the phenomenon. An emo bisexual is anyone in the emo scene due to the fact that bisexuality, real or contrived, is an essential part of the bland, unoriginal, and self-diluted false genre known as emo. Then there's user Super Trooper asking if being a bisexual emo was a cliche, and all the comments telling them that it very much is. Even one of the OG YouTubers, Dan Howell, mentioned it in his Coming Out video.
But wait, all is not lost yet. Do you see that? A triumphant, rallying cry of guitars, stripy hoodies, and black hair dye. Emo had arrived. I swear to God, emo is one of the best things that happened to pop culture in the last 20 years. As well as inventing eyeliner and skinny jeans, a new word hit the theatre nerd goth band kid corner that would change my world forever. Bisexual.
My point is, if bisexuality was just the new hot thing in the 2000s pop culture, it was the new hot thing in 2000s emo. Sadly, nobody really bothered to document it through surveys or historical scripture entries, so the discussed instances are about as much as I can bring to the table. Now that we have established the connection between the 2000s emo and bisexuality, we finally get to the vampires. A bisexual friend of mine that adores vampires told me he liked My Chemical Romance, and I said, "Oh, I'm sure you do." Out of the aforementioned emo trinity, this band has probably had the strongest ties to vampirism and the most influence on vampire media we see nowadays. Yes, we will discuss the 9/11 to Twilight pipeline, but in the next chapter though. My Chemical Romance, for those who were not friendless losers in the 8th grade, is an American rock band that came out of the New Jersey punk scene in the 2000s and, against their own wishes, kind of became the poster children for all things emo. The vampire thing was, as far as I could tell, not really intentional, but more so the outcome of the band's inspirations and aesthetics. The first album, released in 2002, I Brought You My Bullets, You Brought Me Your Love, featured a song called Vampires Will Never Hurt You, one of the many songs alluding to or using vampire imagery. This one is closer to Anne Rice's depiction of romantic and tragic vampires, with the protagonist being afraid that his vampire nature will turn him into a monster and a threat to his loved ones.
Someone get me to the doctor. Someone get me to a church where they can't hold this man up. Can't be.
In an interview with Dot Out magazine a few months after the album's release, Gerard Way said, "Yeah, obviously we use vampires as a metaphor for something else, something deeper than just the supernatural, but there's just something about the bloodsucking Walking Dead that can say so much to people." Now, I obviously need to take you on a little detour regarding Gerard Way himself. He's the lead singer and he comes from a very artistic background. Namely, he was very into comics ever since he was a child, and he even credits DC for saving his life. The oftentimes dark and grim DC aesthetic, especially the one depicted in Doom Patrol during its run with Grant Morrison, left a long-lasting impression on them as a person and their artistic style too. As a teen, Way worked in a comic shop and even published some of his own work. He studied at the School of Visual Arts in New York and after graduation got an internship at Cartoon Network. That same internship would lead to him witnessing 9/11 as it was happening and as a result picking up his long abandoned hobby of writing music. In 2019, Gerard Way described their experience at a Los Angeles Comic-Con panel. "It became my therapy from the PTSD that everyone experienced from 9/11 and processing that." The 2006 documentary Life on the Murder Scene also mentions that. Gerard was on a ferry going to work as a comic book artist. He was drawing, I think, for the Cartoon Network and witnessed the Trade Center towers going down. I'm pretty sure that he saw the bodies falling from the building. That's when he said, "What am I doing with my life? I'm slaving away drawing pictures for corporations and not helping anybody and not making anything in life meaningful for anybody else." At the same Comic-Con panel, Way also shared the vision that he had for the band from the very beginning. "I really liked Nick Cave, and he was a storyteller, and there wasn't a lot of storytelling happening in rock music at the time. It was very much about relationships and boyfriend-girlfriend stuff. It was about relationships, but no one was really doing this conceptual stuff or telling stories. Pop-punk was about the high school experience. I wanted to build worlds with music, and that's what we started to do together in bringing in gothic elements or bringing in vampires and building this thing." So his comic background played a big role in creating some concepts and visual narratives that would heavily influence the way fans perceived the band and its legacy. According to one of the fans on Reddit, during the 2022 Paris concert, Gerard Way introduced the song Vampire Money as, "This is a song about vampires. I think it's like the 5th song we have about vampires." The original poster was a little confused as to whether the lead singer was exaggerating or if they had simply forgotten what MCR songs deal with our fanged bloodsuckers. So let's go through the extensive catalog of vampire songs and imagery the band has to offer in order to see just how strong their ties to the undead really are. I have already mentioned Vampires Will Never Hurt You, but the song wasn't the sole reason the vampire allegations started pooling in. As discussed before, the aesthetics and overall vibes of the band were quite different from what you would normally see within the scene, and it becomes very obvious when you look at the era of their second studio album, 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge. The aesthetic of the band seems to come largely from Gerard and his sort of interest in, dark imagery. Is that something that you vibe with as well? Even though the album doesn't contain any songs about vampires, it's the closest to the undead in terms of motifs and imagery. Revenge being included in the very title and loosely in the overarching album concept brings us back to Anne Rice and her vampires yet again. And you know, the whole coming back from the dead thing isn't quite helping at beating the vampire allegations either. Red, white, and black become the band's staple colors. Not to mention the countless photo shoots where band members pose covered in blood. There was a point where, seriously, every single photo shoot that we were doing had some sort of blood in there. I can't think of one that hasn't, or even entire cover stories depicting them as vampires. Helena, one of their most famous music videos, really solidified the dark visuals and brought in another important element of the vampire lore, Catholic imagery, which once again had always played an important role in media's depictions of the fanged undead. MCR merch has quite often included typical vampire imagery like fangs or blood. Like hell, even the patch I got at a random knockoff merch store in Turkey has fangs on it. The band members even acknowledged the bloodsucker thing in an interview.
We're not vampires, and that's the main thing, because we have one song about vampires on the first record, and it became, alright, so we wear a lot of black, right? But we're wearing colors today.
Their third studio album, The Black Parade, is the most vampire song heavy, as it has not one, but 2 tracks featuring vampires and vampire adjacent things. The first one is obviously Blood, where the main character compares doctors to vampires, seen as they have drained him of all of his blood while he was undergoing treatment.
So give the blood, gallons of the stuff, give them all that they can drink and it will never be enough.
The second one, entitled The Sharpest Lives, uses vampires as a metaphor for those willing to corrupt and use others, exactly as described by Gerard Way in a Dot Out interview I have mentioned earlier. The overall aesthetics of the album, however, do stir away from the red, white, and black theme, seen as the album is focused on a guy dying in a hospital, so we don't really get a lot of visuals regarding bloodsuckers. The band's compilation album, Conventional Weapons, has one song that is notable to the whole vampire thingy we got going on here. It's Tomorrow's Money, which uses vampires as the metaphor for those willing to corrupt and be corrupted. The final fourth studio album, Danger Days, The True Lives of the Fabulous Killjoys, focuses on a group of outlaws that are fighting a corporation that controls basically everything. Isn't really vampire core, if you ask me. It does, however, contain the song Vampire Money, which, you guessed it, has the same vampire metaphor in its lyrics. As Gerard Way has mentioned in an interview in 2011, but the interesting thing about Vampire Money is it's about anything you don't want to do, like anything people assume you're going to do for the money, and you don't because you don't want to do it. It's about saying no over and over and over again. Basically saying no with a song. But you're right, when we started out as a band, we very much used that horror movie imagery. Since the band's return, we have seen Way embrace the whole vampire thing, especially with their onstage outfits. Whereas the Three Cheers era outfits were more so a modern rendering of a 2000s emo vampire, the current outfits bring us back to the vamp roots, and I want to specifically focus on 4 of them. The Bat outfit, which was debuted in New Jersey, is first of all undeniably vampiric, seen as the creatures were heavily associated with vampires ever since the release of Bram Stoker's Dracula, and second, an homage to the earlier days of the band. This shows drum writing Rat off leash, a pun on the phrase "unleash the fucking bats," which has historically been a sort of coat to arms among MCR fans. The phrase can even be found on I Brought You My Bullets, You Brought Me Your Love vinyl, which I had to verify by calling up my mother who lives halfway across the fucking continent. The second important outfit, which was used for one of the shows in Los Angeles, is a recreation of Bela Lugosi's depiction of Dracula. Do I really need to comment on that? No, I do not. But I will quote a Twitter user by the name of CobraTwink87 and say, diversity win. The vampire who just drained your blood is a greasy emo frontman. The third outfit is not as much of a costume as the other ones, but it once again strengthens the ties that the band has to bloodsuckers. At the show in Philadelphia, Gerard Way's t-shirt said, "Pool boy at the Vampire Mansion." The fourth is probably the most meta one. It was a Twilight t-shirt that was combined with the fact that Gerard Way was reading Interview with the Vampire on stage. See? I was not reaching with the Anne Rice stuff. Remember how, like 10 minutes ago, I talked about the stage gay behavior and the concepts of queerness? MCR, whose ties to bloodsuckers we have just established, were kind of notorious for on-stage performances of queerness that were oftentimes considered queerbaiting. Gerard Way has openly talked about their gender identity and the experiments with it, even saying, "I spent a long time being confused about gender when I was younger, and I went to school in drag and art school, and my day was completely different because everybody thought I was a chick. Hot. I looked hot as a chick." Again, nobody owes people detailed descriptions of their queerness, but I do think that in this case we're safe to say that it extends beyond the stage gay. The visible queerness of the lead singer and the ties to vampire media we saw in the aesthetics and lyrics, as well as the influences of the previous period of the romantic vampire depicted by Anne Rice, culminated in the fandom's work and depictions of the members of the so-called emo trinity. In an analysis of the AO3 fanfiction about the Big Three, Pat Hella notes that popular emo bands write the vampire figure into their music and videos. She also attributes the inherent queerness of the vampires present in the text to Anne Rice's influence, with her work blurring the lines between homosociality and homosexuality. The popular vampire alternative universe fanfics, just like Interview with the Vampire, oftentimes take place in a world where love and lust for blood transcend gender and the female and male binary. And a lot of fanfiction writers identify as queer themselves. Among the three main motifs that Pat Hella notes are, first, discussions of vampire morality and the personhood of the vampire, which humanize the bloodsuckers even further than the 20th century media we discussed earlier. Second, the prominence of romanticism in the descriptions and narratives. And third, the tendency to pose gender as entirely irrelevant to any sort of relationship, which is oftentimes associated with bisexuality or pansexuality. An interesting point of the research is that vampires in the emo fandom fiction are almost never presented as the racialized other, supposedly due to the genre's overall whiteness and detachment from political and racial issues. As pointed out by the same author, emo as a genre does not tolerate explicit racism, but it shares in the liberal tendency to elide questions of race, to pretend that race is not a problem anymore. Its subject narrators appear either white or white proximate, race is not discussed, and issues of racial equality and access are quietly substituted for those of personal politics. So, this whole chapter was essentially a dragged out way of saying that Gerard Way, and specifically his stage persona, is kind of the blueprint for the 2000s emo vampire, and that the era of cultural bi-curiosity and low-waisted jeans gave us once again a new type of the fanged undead in the media, one that retained a lot of characteristics of the sympathetic vampire described by Anne Rice, but was more modern, with the whole new masculinity, lust that transcends gender, and performances of queerness on stage thing. Now, My Chemical Romance had a huge influence on pop culture and inspired many wonderful things, like that one fuck-ass red tie black shirt combo I used to wear religiously as a teenager. However, they can also be held partially responsible for boring straight vampires. But the one who can best tell the story of how Mormons ruined the hot fanged undead is a close friend of mine that knows practically everything about American Christianity. Welcome Anya to the stage.
As someone on the internet, you may be aware of the connection between 9/11 and Twilight. However, for the uninitiated, I have chosen to enlighten you a little bit now. As previously mentioned, Gerard Way, an intern at Cartoon Network, was on his way to work one morning in September in 2001 when he witnessed the Twin Towers falling. This led him to have an existential crisis in which he decided to do something he cared about: music. Gathering some choice family and friends, Gerard Way started to make music with a little-known band called My Chemical Romance. Except, emo music is like the biggest thing in the world right now in the late 90s and early 2000s, and My Chemical Romance is now super popular. After releasing their second album in 2004, 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge, their music reached the ears of one Mormon housewife who felt inspired by the raw emotionality of these New Jerseyans while writing a book that she was working on based off of a dream. This book ended up getting published under the name Twilight. This book would become a worldwide phenomenon and would lead to many consequences that we are still dealing with to this very day. I find it important to emphasize that there is no proof that Stephenie Meyer based Twilight off of My Chemical Romance fanfiction, despite what rumors on the internet may say. She has, however, stated that the My Chemical Romance song Famous Last Words was an inspiration for Jacob's character specifically. This butterfly effect, 9/11 to Twilight, can be taken in either direction, further into history or closer to the present, connecting all manner of different things, from Ronald Reagan to the downfall of TV personality Ellen DeGeneres. Hi, I'm Shasha's friend, former Twilight-obsessed teen and current person who likes learning about American Christianity with the fascination of someone witnessing a car crash from a distance. Today we'll be discussing Twilight, Mormonism, and the stratification of vampires. Before I get into that, since we are discussing Twilight, I would like to encourage everyone to donate to the Move to Higher Ground initiative put forward by the Quileute tribe. The Quileute have had their name, image, and history used by Stephenie Meyer in the Twilight movies without any compensation being given to the people themselves. The Tribe of 2000 sits on the Washington coast with the majority of their buildings within a tsunami zone. They have successfully raised the money to move their tribal school further away from the ocean, successfully protecting the future generation of the Quileute people. Now they are asking for donations to move their senior housing, government administration, and natural resources department in order to protect the culture and future of the Quileute tribe. Please consider donating at the link in bio or at mthg.org. That's movetohigherground.org. For prosperity's sake, I will now be summarizing the first Twilight book/movie for the uninitiated. Isabella Swan, or Bella, is a clumsy teen with a neglectful mother who moves to rural Washington to live with her dad in the middle of her junior year of high school. In Washington, she meets a really hot guy with a really hot and weird family dynamic who takes a liking to her. And by a liking to her, I mean he stalks her. The hot guy, Edward Cullen, tries to warn Bella away from him, but Bella isn't dissuaded because he's hot and she is very horny. His final efforts to scare her off culminates in Eddie showing off his super strength and super speed, from which Bella puts together that he is, in fact, a vampire, despite those two things not being typical vampire traits. Edward reveals that he is a vegetarian, only drinking animal blood, despite still having cravings for human blood and specifically for Bella's blood. None of this, not even the stalking, is a deal breaker for Bella, so they end up dating. They happen to meet another group of vampires while out and about with Edward's weird, intercodependent vampire family. One of these other vampires wants to eat Bella so badly, it's the only character trait that we ever learn about this man. The bad vampire manipulates Bella into coming to him in an effort to try to kill her. However, Eddie and friends save the day and show up at the very last minute. However, Edward has to proceed to suck some of Bella's blood to get the vampire venom out of her so that she does not turn into a vampire. The series evolves from there to include things such as werewolves, racism, the Italian vampire mafia, depression, abusive and controlling behavior, a body horror pregnancy, and a series climax so disappointing that the movie had to trick you into thinking something interesting would actually happen. In short, Mormonism ruined the bisexual vampire. As discussed throughout this entire video, vampire lore and sexuality are inherently intertwined. However, Twilight vampires are practically sexless by comparison, and not even Anne Rice sexless, where they still have like weird sexual encounters without actually having sex. Not only are the hero vampires suppressing their literal sexuality, they're suppressing their bloodlust as well. Stephenie Meyer, the author of the Twilight Saga, is a practicing Mormon, or a member of the Latter-day Saints Church, a denomination which believes that there is a third book after the Old and New Testament to which they adhere to. The teachings of Mormonism change over time, so it's important to note that they may not stay the same, or they may not be the same as when Stephenie Meyer was writing Twilight. The Mormon law of chastity looms large over the Twilight Saga and its content. The Latter-day Saints, or LDS Church, states that the law of chastity requires that sexual relations be reserved for marriage between a man and a woman. Edward and the rest of the Cullens are ersatz Mormons within the narrative of Twilight, with such fun parallels as Carlisle, the father figure, being a stand-in for Joseph Smith, and the golden vampire Rosalie being a pretty direct parallel for the golden plates that Joseph Smith found. Also, if your hair ever gets ripped out as a vampire, it'll never grow back. You can reattach limbs, but if someone rips a chunk of your hair out, that shit's gone. So the big joke is that all the vampires wear wigs, all the Cullens wear wigs, because they pulled each other's hair out years ago. The main line of Mormonism throughout the story is Edward's actions in regards to his relationship with Bella. The teachings surrounding homosexuality as of 2024 do not condemn the gay identity or gay thoughts. However, they do condemn homosexual actions as they condemn all sexual activity outside of marriage between a man and a woman. Returning to Twilight, Edward does not even want to kiss Bella for fear that it will awaken his bloodlust for her, i.e., his sexuality. Edward's ability to put that aside and kiss her as well as drink her blood by the end of the first book show him overcoming his base urges. Edward is stronger than his sexuality in these moments. He may have these thoughts, but he won't act on them. After the first book, Edward spends the time up until their marriage rejecting Bella's sexuality outside of chaste kisses without tongue. That detail is important because there is a fear that Edward could in fact turn her into a vampire by kissing her with tongue. He is a sexless vampire, in action and in metaphor as a vegetarian, rejecting his desires and the desires of others. Arguably, his adherence to inactivity within the law of chastity frames him as a homosexual. However, his straightness persists otherwise. The Twilight Saga and the properties contained within are nothing if not promoters of American family values. Returning to Mormonism briefly, the LDS Church as a religion is inherently American. Not only was it founded in the United States, but the Book of Mormon, as their central doctrine, is framing Mormonism as the creation myth of America. Mormons are the American Christians as ordained by Jesus Christ himself. As discussed by Chiho Nakagawa in her essay, Safe Sex with Defanged Vampires, New Vampire Heroes in Twilight and the Southern Vampire Mysteries, the Cullens are a distinctly American other. While Nakagawa does not mention Mormonism in her analysis of otherness, I would posit that it is a large part of it. The Cullens are American by citizenship and values, and yet they remain the other. Part of this portrayal is their intentional distance from others, which I would argue comes from their Mormonism. Mormonism is not a religion that tends to play well with others, both on an individual and a church level. Those of us who have grown up around Mormons often see them keep to interactions with other church members while maintaining a typically friendly yet distant demeanor with outsiders. Their large families with many siblings keep to their owns, as the Cullens do. This is not to say that all Mormons are like this, of course. However, they are similarly ostracized by other American Christians who tend to view their religion as not a real Christian denomination. Mormons are seen as strange or culty or too white bread or boring for many, the distance that they have perpetuated by both sides. They are the true Americans who will always stand apart from the rest. Finally, for the Mormonism section, true to the American way, both the Twilight Saga and the LDS Church are absolutely filled with racism. The Mormon Church, as an entity, has racism at the center of their doctrine. Very simply put, the Book of Mormon teaches that a group of white people, led by a prophet in 600 BC, left the Arabian Peninsula to sail to America, an empty land. The prophet's children split into two groups, the Nephites, who would go on to become Mormons, and the Lamanites, who opposed them. The Lamanites had their skins turned dark for their sins and are considered to be the ancestors of Native Americans today. Additionally, black people were considered to have less pure and valuable souls and were not allowed to hold the priesthood until 1978. Black Mormons were taught that when they died, their skin would become white in the highest kingdom of heaven. In the Twilight novels, there are no canonical black vampires, since the transformation into a vampire leaches the color from everyone's skin. The Twilight Saga guidebook describes that the hue varies slightly, with darker-skinned humans having a barely discernible olive tone to their vampire skin, but the light shade remains the same. Stephenie Meyer famously fought casting any people of color as vampires in the first movie, and only allowed a villain to be cast as non-white. The representation of the werewolves is also horribly racist. The stories of the Quileute tribe were taken and bastardized into something that Stephenie Meyer could fit into her vampire love story. Meyer portrays several instances of grooming done by native characters, but justifies it by claiming that they are a slave to their desires. Additionally, the humanity of the native characters is secondary to their animalistic nature, i.e., their wolf forms. The tribe was never consulted or compensated, despite their prominent role in the saga. I will once again encourage you to donate to move to higher ground. Despite the Americanization of the vampire through Edward, he is a man of feeling, tortured by his own thoughts. As the emo man often was, but Edward was just that, more so man than vampire. There is a strong tradition of the feeling vampire, but Edward sees his monstrosity coming not from his supernatural nature, but instead from his feelings of lust and bloodlust. Edward does not kill any humans throughout the course of the books or the movies. However, those that he has killed in the past he deems to be monstrous themselves. Even in his least human state, feeding on humans, Edward distances himself from the monster, and later furthers this by refusing his desires altogether. In his time with Bella, he works to understand and balance her feelings as well as his own, feelings which arguably make him human. Edward does walk in the emotional shoes of many vampires who have come before him, while simultaneously eschewing history and tradition of what came before, as Stephenie Meyer did with the Quileute tribe, and as Mormons did with the peoples native to America for time immemorial. Twilight, while known for the vampire, and more broadly, the supernatural fantasy and romance craze it created, is not typical of many historical vampire tropes. Not only do the vampires famously sparkle instead of burn up in the sun, they do not need to be invited in, they do not fear religious symbols, they do not sleep in coffins, and they cannot be killed with stakes. And on top of that, they don't even have fangs. These vampires don't have sex, and arguably aren't even vampires to begin with. The non-monstrosity of the Twilight vampires, coupled with their popularity, forced later vampire depictions to be more self-aware of their portrayals. The vampires not only know that they are vampires, but they also know what type of vampires they are not. The foreign and queer sexuality of vampires is all but gone from the Twilight saga. They are the American good old boys who wait until marriage. The need for separation from the melodramatic and non-traditional nature of Twilight forced the vampire media that followed to make fun of itself. Fewer and fewer vampire stories in the 2000s and the 2010s were taking themselves seriously. Whether it be the Fall Out Boy music video for the song A Little Less 16 Candles, A Little More Touch Me, or the property that Shasha will be discussing next. Once again, please consider donating to the Move to Higher Ground initiative to support the Quileute tribe.
You're dead, you're dead, you're dead, you're dead and out of this world.
The 2019 show What We Do in the Shadows, which received both critical and universal acclaim, is based on a 2014 mockumentary by the same name, but it's not often mentioned that the whole let's make vampires a little silly thing started way earlier. The creators, Taika Waititi and Jermaine Clement, met during their student years at the New Zealand's Victoria University of Wellington and formed comedy groups So You're a Man and The Humor Beasts. At some point, they started doing vampire gags as part of the live shows. In an interview with New York Times, the co-authors recapped this the following way. We had played this thing on stage one time. Taika, Brad, and I all went to Calgary to do a show where one of us was on stage playing a vampire doing vampire jokes. The only one I remember is like, I just flew from Transylvania and boy are my arms tired. Because they were wings, and I flew all the way. I think that was Taika doing that, and then I'd get up from the audience dressed as a vampire too, and I'm heckling him. You've been heckling me for 250 years! When we first met in Wellington, nothing was really open late at night except for video game parlors. We would hang around, playing air hockey and doing those kind of characters. Ugh, my old rival. Just kept the stupid thing going on for ages. I gotta admit, using the Slavic accent for vampire characters and not to intimidate people feels kind of weird to me. The running gag resulted in a 2005 short film entitled What We Do in the Shadows, Interviews with Some Vampires. According to Jermaine Clement, he was pushing for a character comedy with vampires, while Taika Waititi was interested in doing a mockumentary, so naturally they merged the two ideas. In an interview with FilmLink, Clement said, I suggested that this might be a good subject for a mockumentary, because you don't often see mockumentaries about things you can't see in real life. The 2005 What We Do in the Shadows is of interest to us because it's the foundation for all of the following projects with the same name. Particularly, it takes the classic romantic vampire archetype and makes it face mundane things like doing the dishes or trying to make your roommates follow the chore chart. And while the characters are nowhere near developed, there are a few things that I feel like I should mention. First of all, it makes the previously more subtle parallel between sucking someone's blood and sex very obvious. I mean, Volvus literally spells it out.
You know why virgins is why a sandwich that someone hasn't already eaten.
More to that, none of the vampires mention anything in regards to sex, so we can safely assume that the movie is following Anne Rice's logic, where biting someone and draining their blood is the epitome of desire. We do, however, get the scene of Iago trying and failing miserably to rizz up a lady. The vampires the mockumentary is focused on are recognized as the other by people on the street, but not the racialized other like the classic tradition suggests. People who pass them on the street repeatedly yell out homophobic and transphobic slurs, to which one of the characters replies,
We're vampires! We're vampires, not transvestites.
The vampires, however, fail to recognize the ways in which they are different from the mortals they encounter. Wolvus, for example, believes that the slurs directed their way are coming from the fact that they are being followed by a cameraman, not their behavior or appearances.
Why do people have to call us faggots just because we have a camera?
So, in this universe, queerness, even if it's just perceived queerness, comes in tandem with being a vampire. In 2014, Clement and Waititi reprised their roles as co-authors and co-stars in a feature-length mockumentary building off of the same idea. The main cast of characters remains the same, but their storylines get more developed and explored further, and the creators admittedly got deeper into vampire lore in order to expand the movie universe in a cohesive way.
We did do a lot of research. I call it procrastinating, but we did a lot of research into vampirism and vampire lore, and ways to kill vampires. All the folklore from like
Eastern Europe
and Eastern Europe, and even in Asia, because there's a lot of cultures have got their versions of vampires.
Among other classic influences, like both movie adaptations of Dracula, Fright Night, and Nosferatu, Clement also names the movie version of Anne Rice's book. Interview with the Vampire was something we talked about a lot when we were making the movie. We've always thought of our characters as the real vampires, as opposed to movie vampires, but they still like those movies because they glorify vampires and their lifestyle. While they were filming the feature-length version, an idea of a sitcom started circulating, as Clement mentions in an interview. A lot of the crew said this could be a sitcom because it's about the relationships and dynamics within that house. We heard it a lot, and quite a few people asked if we were interested in making a TV version, and I think Scott Rudin was the most demanding. The creators were approached with the idea numerous times, but seen as both of them were busy with their careers and not as involved with each other anymore, it did not simply seem doable or worth it. So when Jermaine Clement agreed to the sitcom thing, he decided to keep the general tone and idea, but introduce a new set of characters. I think the original idea that people were thinking was that we could use the same characters, but I thought it might be good to just change the dynamic a bit. When it comes to Taika Waititi, he became the executive producer of the show, directed the pilot and 2 other episodes in the first season, and reprised his character for a cameo. So 2019 is the year the show finally gets created, 14 years after the initial short film, and God knows however many years after the vampire gag first entered Taika Waititi's and Jermaine Clement's live shows. The long way the idea had to go through in order to be adapted into the show we now know and love is the reason why Vampire World is so well thought out, especially considering the fact that in those 14 years, vampire media had a huge tonal shift due to Twilight. The show, just like its movie predecessors, goes back to romantic vampires for character and world inspiration, while also following the mockumentary style rules. We stay pretty basic 70s, 80s vampire rules with a little bit of 30s. They can turn into bats, they can't go in the sunlight, they don't sparkle in the sun, they die. They have to be invited in a lot of literature, vampires have to be invited into private buildings, but this is a documentary, so it's the real rules, which mean they have to be invited into any building. What We Do in the Shadows takes romantic and aristocratic vampires and makes them silly guys with mundane lives, which is the basis of the show's humor. As Stephanie Robinson, a co-executive producer and a writer, points out, I don't know that we were consciously aware of the concept that we were making a commentary on the nature of vampires in pop culture. But I think what makes the show so funny and gives us more story to mine from is that these are not the glamorous, glitzy, shortless vampires that you've grown accustomed to. It's about the more mundane practices of being a vampire, which I just think is funnier. More to that, vampires in the show's universe are very aware of the way that they are portrayed in media. For example, Nandor, while trying to impress Baron, tries his best to look like bloodsuckers from Twilight.
Glitter?
Yes, get me some glitter.
Whatever for, Master.
Oh, I want to do something special for the Immortal One's arrival. I'm going to sprinkle it on my face and on my body, like Twilight.
The show, just like a lot of modern media, is very aware of what came before, and while it brings back the old-timey aristocratic vampires, it is very tongue-in-cheek in a way that it portrays them.
We follow the rules of, anything from, Interview with the Vampire, even the kickball scene, which was, it's so funny because I was with Catherine Hardwicke last night. We went to see a movie here in Toronto. She's filming here, and she directed Twilight, the first one. And so she was like, she was watching the show and then literally texted me, was like, wait, did you guys do? I was like, yep, you directed it.
What the show brings back from older canon is, interestingly, the portrayal of vampires as the racialized other. But unlike the 19th century literature or early 20th century movies, it is depicted as pure fact and not a threat to the normal way of life. We see that both within the show and in various creators' interviews. As co-showrunner Paul Sims puts it, the vampires are foreigners in America. It seemed right to have actors who were also, in a way, foreigners in America. If you saw someone who was obviously from California doing a Transylvanian accent, it would just seem somehow bogus and fake.
Kayvan is from England, and Natasha's from England, and Matt Berry is from England. Having these British actors, besides the fact that they're very funny, it gives you more of a sense of being out of place or in a place you're not familiar with.
Hence we get vampires that speak in an accent that isn't typical to their place of residence for the first time since Vampire Chronicles books.
You really are the most devious bastard in New York City.
The character of Nadia, for instance, was even changed to reflect the Greek background of the actress portraying her. Our faint friends are also perceived as the other by human characters in the universe.
Good evening. Go back to your own country. What the fuck?
But what about the other type of othering? Well, that's kind of what we're here for. Vampires in the show are perceived as the sexual other by humans, namely their neighbors. For example, Sean, the guy next door, goes straight to them when he wants to organize a pride parade.
Respectfully, neighbor Sean, yes. What has this got to do with us? We are very busy. A little bird recently flew into my bedroom and I've been trying to make him my friend.
Yeah, well, we just wanted to consult with you guys, considering you're members of the LGBTQ LMNOP community, and we consider you guys heroes for that.
Literally the gayest things on the block.
So even though vampires are easily identified as the other by the humans within the show's universe, it doesn't seem to have the same fearful or hateful connotation we've seen in Victorian vampire media like Dracula. Circling back to Sean's Pride Parade, we see the way vampire characters are confused at being called members of the community, to the point of where you'd think they weren't queer at all. Their queerness, however, is showcased quite often throughout the show. As Caruso points out, nearly 2 centuries later, however, the inherent queerness of vampires is no longer simply subtext, it is now plainly stated. The vampire characters neither consider themselves queer nor put any label on their gender or sexuality, because it comes to them naturally. Unlike Anne Rice's vampires, the ones we see in the show are openly sexual beings, yet we maintain the parallels between second blood and sex, even if those aren't strictly equated. None of the bloodsuckers state their identity or come out in any way, and their sexual fluidity and attraction regardless of gender is stated in a very nonchalant manner. For example, when Nandor asks a genie to bring back 37 wives from his human life, he clarifies.
37 wives, and
so what was her name?
Might have been a he, they weren't all women.
You could do that back then?
Of course. Some of my wives were girl wives, some of them were guy wives. It's not that different.
When Nadia switches bodies with her doll and goes on dates looking for a hookup, we see her flirt with both men and women. The vampires mention their previous love affairs without emphasizing the gender of their partner. And most of the times, those affairs are treated the same plot-wise, regardless of whether they are hetero or homosexual. Like in the pilot, we learn that Nadia and Laszlo, the married couple of the show, have both had an affair with the same vampire, but the reveal of that is not portrayed as something shocking or outrageous.
I also love, like, speaking of gay, I just love that Laszlo is, like, just so bisexual, pansexual, whatever, and just talks about sucking dick and cock all the time.
Well, all the vampires are queer.
Really? Yeah?
All the vampires are queer, yeah, because if you remember, there was an episode where Laszlo and Nandor don't get off, and they're, like, waiting by the room. They're like, so, do you want to? We should. And they go in and finish each other off in the room.
That's right.
Yeah, and I love what we do about the show is that being queer is not the demise of anyone. Being queer is part of their life, and it's just intertwined into the story.
Yeah.
And it's never the topic of conversation. It's never like, oh, I think they're queer.
The show makes it seem like bisexuality, or at least the lack of care about the gender of one's objects of passion, is something to be expected from vampires. It doesn't make them special and is not considered scandalous. Therefore, not worthy of discussion or any sort of coming out or identifying as the other. Even Colin Robinson, the energy vampire who is portrayed as the master of boring people to the brink of death, has both homo and heterosexual relationships on the show. So when Sean calls them part of the queer community, the vampire characters don't really get it right away. The only character that really comes out on the show is Guillermo, Nander's familiar. As Jamie Paul puts it, he is everything the rest of his housemates are not. They're vampires and he's a descendant of the vampire killer Van Helsing. They exude vampire coolness and he's a spherical, sweater-vested normie. They're debauched hedonists and he's straight-laced. They are recklessly irresponsible, feeding from one cockamamie fancy to the next with no thought of consequences, and he's the lone voice of reason, stressed and at wit's end. Most notably, they're bisexual and non-monogamous, and he's gay and monogamous. Guillermo's coming out is not a major plot point, nor does the show portray him as more interesting or exotic afterwards. In fact, not a single one of the vampire characters is surprised or impressed, and they still treat him as the human equivalent of a beige cardigan. In their world, being homosexual and monogamous is not queer enough. As pointed out by Anne Gregg, these gay vampires live in a sort of utopia. Everyone is bisexual until they say they are not type of world. The characters being gay does not have to be addressed. In fact, while the rest of the world, and Guillermo, may be in awe of the vampire's blatant sexuality, none of the vampires care. The reason for this was theorized by Harvey Guillen, the actor who portrays Guillermo, on Trixie and Katya's podcast.
Sort of like, these vampires have been alive for so long, it's sort of like a later stage of evolution that they are a little queer and don't even care.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, you know, exactly right. Like the idea that if you lived for hundreds of years and you had nothing to lose, what do you have to fear? The reason that people are so scared is because society makes them scared to come out and be queer. But if everyone had nothing to lose and you were going to live your life and you're a vampire and you can defend yourself, you have no fear. You're like, I love this, I love that, I love everything. What are you going to say about it?
So we see the new age fanged bloodsuckers exist in a world where they are still perceived as the other, while the fact that they bite both ways is something that is considered the norm in their own little vampire bubble. In a way, they continue the tradition of Byronic even bisexuals, but do it openly and without paying any mind to it. Their homo and heterosexual encounters are treated the same, and being queer is nothing interesting or shocking to them. As written by Jamie Paul, vampires may have no reflection, but they are a reflection of us. What We Do in the Shadows holds up a mirror revealing a youth culture that is more queer, more sexually fluid, and more disdainful of tradition than ever, but that seeks to invert hierarchies instead of softening them. There are obviously more examples of bisexual vampires that I could go on and on about, but that would simply mean the video would never end considering the rate at which the vampire content is being produced. For instance, the new Interview with the Vampire show, which I specifically decided to ignore for the sake of this video not being 3 hours long. If there is something to be said, it is that every single historical era needs its own vampire, seen as the bloodsuckers usually reflect our views, norms, and worries. Vampires have historically lent themselves to a queer reading due to them being portrayed as the other, challenging or threatening the social order. I mean, look at Carmilla and the lesbian vampire stereotype that developed from there, or the 1936 movie Dracula's Daughter. Whether vampires are projections of a closeted Victorian man's anxieties, a vengeful diss against Byron, a greasy emo frontman, or a campy reimagining of the previous undead lore, bisexuals cannot help but be entranced by them, because we get it. The Everything Vampire book puts it beautifully. The topic of vampire sexuality is one that remains a hotly debated subject. Are they straight, homosexual, lesbian, or bisexual? The safe answer is all of the above. So yeah, originally this was supposed to be like a 30-ish minute video, but I might have gotten a little too deep into it. This is by far the biggest project that I have done on the internet, and finally finishing it after like months of research and preparation feels grand. Once again, please consider donating to the Move to Higher Ground initiative of the Quileute tribe. The link will be in the description of the video, or you can also find them at mthg.org. And here's a special list of thanks to everyone who has helped me along the way. Thanks to Anya for always listening to vampire facts I found while researching but couldn't put in the video, and for doing the Twilight section, because I honestly cannot imagine anyone more qualified to do that. Thanks to my buddy Vic, who lent me his tie for the emo section and promised to watch every single second of this video. You better send me a screenshot of this moment right now. Thanks to my cat Graf Vasily for cooperating on his little cameos and posing his little cape and overall being the best pet I could ever wish for. Thanks to Dr. Judith Fathalla from Lancaster University for always absolutely serving in her work about fandom practices. I really enjoy reading her stuff, and I quoted her in this video as well. Lastly, thanks to the YouTube channel, The Cozy Representative, because like half of the time I spent editing this video, his stuff was playing in the background, and I really enjoy his content. And yeah, here is a blooper reel for anyone who made it this far. And I might... How the fuck do you pronounce this fucking word? Don't believe me? Ask a bisexual. Привет, малышка. Привет, крошка. А что ты делаешь? Drinking directly from the neck, which is often viewed as a sensational location. A neck is a fucking sensational location. Would you look at that? I became a vampire to suck blood and to fuck forever. Where Lestat accepts something like killing people as merely part of vampire nature, Louis... What does Louis do?
Called 3 Cheers for Sweet... I'm gonna redo that. After releasing their second album in 2004... It's just, you're gonna be playing the credits and it's just gonna be me trying to say 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge 5 times. 3 cheers for Sweet Revenge. Queers, cheers, blood, revenge. The devil's here, I think? Like... Oh, sweet cheers for 3 Revenge again. God damn it. Okay, in Soviet Russia, 3 cheers is not for sweet revenge. Sweet cheers is for 3 revenge. Sweet 3s for cheers revenge. 3 queers and Ray Torres there. 4 cheers for sweet Mormons.